My name is Ilara. 5 years ago, my mother folded her hands on the dining table and told me I was no longer welcome in our home. "We just don't recognize who you've become," she said. Her voice trembled, not with sadness, but with rehearsed disappointment. My father sat beside her in silence, like he always did when things got uncomfortable. And across the room, my twin brother Ezra stood leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his smug smile slicing through me, sharper than any word. That morning, I had woken up in the guest room I used to call my childhood bedroom. I was supposed to be home for a short visit, just a weekend break after finishing my final round of residency applications in Boston. My life was finally coming together after years of grinding through med school, long shifts, and surviving on instant noodles. Or so I thought. There was no family breakfast waiting for me that Sunday, no cinnamon rolls, no dad's coffee, just a summons. "Everyone downstairs, now." I should have known. It started with Ezra, always Ezra. "She's been lying," he said, tossing a manila folder onto the table, to all of us. Inside were printed emails, some real, some doctored, photos too. A message I'd sent to my former mentor about possibly leaving Boston early, captioned to look like I'd been fired, screenshots of private chats taken out of context. Ezra and I hadn't been close in years, but I never thought he'd go that far. "You're not being honest about what you're doing with your life," he went on. "You said you were in med school, but no one can find your name in the residency matches. Dad and I checked." "I withdrew," I said, "because I got a better opportunity. A private research placement in Geneva. It's under NDA. "A likely story," he snorted. "And you're seeing someone, a man who's, let's just say, not from our world." My heart pounded. Ezra didn't know who he was talking about. He couldn't. I had been so careful. "You're endangering the family's name," my mother snapped. "Your father's retirement investments, his partners. People are watching us. We raised you better than to lie and disappear with some stranger." I felt dizzy. This wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. Ezra leaned closer, voice low. "Just tell them the truth. You didn't leave med school for research. You left because you got pregnant. And you're keeping it hidden. That's what this is really about, isn't it?" Silence. I could barely breathe. And then he said the thing that gutted me completely. "You're just like your birth mother." My vision blurred. My hands trembled. I was adopted at 2. My parents, these people, had raised me, clothed me, praised me, and now they weaponized that fact like a knife. I stood, legs numb. "You have no idea what you're saying." Mom didn't even look at me. She just whispered, "It's time for you to go." "We've packed a bag. There's nothing more to say." Outside, the sun was blinding. The sidewalk scorched my soles through thin shoes as I walked to my car. I didn't remember putting the keys in the ignition. I drove for hours. I think I passed the state line, but I couldn't say where I stopped. Eventually, I pulled into a gravel lot behind a shuttered bakery. My throat was dry, my fingers stiff. That night, I slept in the back seat, curled around the one bag they let me take. In my palm, I held a folded ultrasound image I hadn't shown anyone. 9 weeks, 2 tiny silhouettes, and one impossible truth. I was carrying the heirs of one of the richest families in Europe, but they didn't know that yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds scratching at the trees behind the abandoned bakery. I hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. My head pounded. The light hurt my eyes. I walked to a gas station half a mile away, bought a protein bar and a bottle of water with the last $8 I had. I sat on the curb behind the building and ate slowly, forcing every bite down through the nausea. I'd been queasy for days, but now it had turned into something more steady, more real. I knew I had to find somewhere safe, Not just for me, for them. I opened my email on the gas station Wi-Fi. No replies, no messages from the man whose name I had never dared write in full. Lucien Marchand, the son of a European pharmaceutical magnate. He'd come to Boston as part of a research delegation. He saw me speak at a graduate seminar and emailed me the next morning. Polite, interested, curious. And somehow it grew. He wasn't like the others. No smug arrogance, no performance, just questions, thoughtful ones, and a kind of sadness in his eyes he never explained. I hadn't told him yet. I hadn't planned to. Not until I was certain I could carry the truth alone. But alone was no longer a luxury I could afford. So I did it. I sent him a message, one sentence. I left Boston. I'm pregnant. And I didn't know who else to tell. Then I turned off my phone. I couldn't bear to watch it stay silent. That night, I checked into a roadside motel under the name Elena M. The room was dim, smelled like mildew and old linen, but it was a roof. I laid on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I whispered to the air, "You are not a mistake. No matter what they say, I will protect you." I placed a hand over my stomach. The bump wasn't showing yet, but I could feel them, like two quiet pulses below the surface, waiting. I drifted off finally to a sleep filled with shadows and light, unsure what tomorrow would bring. But I knew one thing with crystal certainty. When I woke up the next morning, light spilled through the thin motel curtains, like gold poured over stained glass. I didn't check my phone right away. For once, I was scared of what it might say, or not say. But eventually, I reached for it. One notification. From Lucien Marchand. Subject, please tell me where you are. I opened it with shaking hands. Ilara, tell me where you are. I'm flying to you tonight. Please don't disappear again. If it's true, if it's really true, then everything changes. I stared at those lines for a long time. He hadn't called me crazy. He hadn't asked for proof. He just came. 6 hours later, a car pulled up outside the motel. Black rental, out of place among the dusty sedans and rusty pickups. I watched from the window, uncertain, frozen in place. But when the door opened and he stepped out, wearing the same worn jacket he'd once left at my apartment in Boston after we stayed up too late reading articles, something inside me broke open. I opened the door before he could knock. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He crossed the threshold slowly, like he was entering something sacred. Then, in the middle of the room with peeling wallpaper and a flickering light, he dropped to his knees and rested his hands, gently, reverently, on my hips. "Are they okay?" he whispered. I nodded, then finally, "Two." He looked up at me, eyes wide. "Twins?" I didn't want to believe it either, but yes. Lucien stood and held me, but not tightly. Not the kind of embrace that asks for anything in return. Just presence. He stayed for 3 days. We didn't speak much about the future or about his family. The Martians were powerful, old money private. They'd never approved of his time in America, let alone the idea of a child with someone like me. He didn't say that out loud, but I knew. What he did say was this: "We'll find a way. You don't have to go back to them. You don't owe anyone anything." And for the first time in weeks, I believed it. We rented a small place just outside Tucson. Nothing fancy. Just a one-bedroom bungalow with cracked tile floors and humming AC. I got a job as a lab assistant at a local clinic. Lucien went back to Europe briefly. Something about settling finances quietly. When he returned, he brought cash. Not flashy, not suspicious. Just enough. "This is yours," he said. "Whatever you choose to do." I looked at the envelope, then at the mirror behind him. My reflection didn't look like someone starting over. She looked like someone rising from wreckage. "You know," I said, almost to myself. They thought they were cutting me out of the bloodline. Lucian stepped forward. They were wrong. I turned, met his eyes. I'm not the mistake, I said. I'm the legacy. And he didn't argue. He just said, then let's build it. 3 weeks later, the first letter arrived. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in careful script. Inside, legal language, cold and sharp. Cease and desist. Defamation of character. Violation of familial confidentiality. Signed at the bottom in bold ink, Ezra W. Langley. I sat on the porch steps, the Arizona sun hot against my back, and reread the letter twice. It wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a declaration of war. Lucian stood in the doorway behind me. They found you, I nodded. I think Ezra's trying to ruin me before I can even start. Then maybe it's time you started louder. The next morning, I filed the articles of incorporation for Langley and Sons Biomedical. I knew the name would sting, because the truth was, Ezra hadn't earned it. I had. The research I'd started in Boston, the hormonal therapy work, the genetic sequencing model I'd been building late at night while everyone else drank and played politics. I hadn't left it behind. I'd hidden it, protected it, refined it. Now it was time to use it. I applied for 3 grants under my legal name. I started consultations with 2 women's clinics in the Southwest. I made a plan, 1 brick at a time. Lucian supported me, quietly, fiercely. When the nausea got worse, he drove me to appointments. When the fear came at night like a wave, he stayed up and mapped out investor strategies on paper napkins. You know, he said one night as I curled on the couch, if you win, if you build this, they'll come. You know, he said one night as I curled on the couch, if you win, if you build this, they'll come crawling back. I don't care if they do, I said, because this time I won't be on the porch waiting. He smiled, small and sad. You really don't need them anymore, do you? I shook my head. They made me believe I was disposable, I said, but they forgot I was born with more than just their name. I was born with fire. That night, I opened my old email, the one Ezra had once hacked. I started drafting a public letter, one that would burn, and I signed it. Dr. Elara Langley. Founder, mother, not yours, to erase. I posted the letter on a Sunday. It wasn't dramatic, no photos, no hashtags, just words. I didn't expect anything to happen. But 24 hours later, my inbox overflowed. Emails from women I didn't know, scientists, founders, single mothers, survivors. One message read, "You don't know me, but you gave me the courage to walk out with my son today. I've been trying to leave for 3 years. I didn't think I had the right. Thank you." Another, they did the same to me. Different name, same silence. I'm investing. And then, late that night, an email from a foundation in Zurich. We'd like to fund the first phase of your research. Full backing. Discretion guaranteed. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. The room was quiet. The baby stirred slightly. Small movements, like waves beneath skin. I placed both hands on my stomach and whispered, "They wanted me silent." 2 months after I published the letter, I stepped onto the polished stone floor of the Langford International Summit for Women in Biotech. Not as a guest, not as an intern, as a speaker. There was a banner near the main entrance, clean white background, minimal type. Elara Langley, disrupting inheritance, rebuilding from rejection. I was 28, 6 months pregnant with twins, and walking into a room full of people who had no idea what it had cost me to be there. Lucian offered to walk with me, but I told him no. I need to do this alone. Inside, the room buzzed with that quiet hum of money and ambition. Tables littered with business cards, faces angled toward opportunity. But when I stepped up to the mic, a hush fell. I told them the story, not of betrayal, but of clarity. "How do you know who you are?" I said, "when everything that shaped you wants to forget you existed?" And then I showed them. I outlined my new trials, explained the tech we were developing, a portable hormone sequencing unit that could run diagnostics for women's reproductive health without invasive lab work or 6-week delays. The room didn't clap right away. They just stared. Then someone in the back stood up. An older woman, gray hair pulled into a tight knot, expensive scarf, serious eyes. She asked one question. "Who owns your patent?" I didn't blink. "I do." And then they clapped. The wave of it rolled forward. Applause that felt like breath returning to my lungs after years underwater. Later that evening, I stood by a marble column checking my phone. Dozens of new messages, and one that stopped me cold. From Mom. Subject, family. I opened it. "We saw the article. Your father is embarrassed. Ezra is furious. But your sister wants to talk." No apology, no acknowledgement, just a pivot. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, because I was indifferent. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my clutch. The following day, I received another message, not from family, from a reporter. "I've been researching the Marchand family for years. I know about Lucien. I know about the foundation. You should know. There's something bigger happening here." I froze. Was this about the twins? Or about me? Because if the world was finally watching, I had to be ready for what came next. I met the reporter in a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and secrecy. Her name was Mara Chen, and her eyes flicked like someone who'd been followed before. "Do you know how many biotech founders disappear when their names are tied to the Marchand family?" she asked without preamble. "No," I said, "but I have a feeling you're going to tell me." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, grainy surveillance stills, financial trail maps, annotated timelines, names I didn't recognize, companies that looked clean on the surface, but, according to Mara, funneled billions into private initiatives tied to experimental medical tech. Some were legal, others, not so much. "You're not the scandal, Alara," she said. "You're the threat. The moment you claimed your research publicly, they noticed. And someone in Lucien's family doesn't like that." I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. Back at home that night, Lucien was quiet. He'd known this was coming. "I've kept them at arm's length for years," he said, "but this, you, makes me a liability again." "You're not walking away," I said. His eyes flinched just slightly. "No," he replied. "I'm going to Paris." "What?" "Not forever, just long enough to see who tries to stop me." It wasn't a goodbye. Not exactly. But when he left the next morning, something cracked open again. I stood in the nursery, still unfinished. Paint swatches pinned to the walls, tiny clothes still folded with tags. My fingers pressed gently to the curve of my belly. "We are not fragile," I whispered. "We are flame." That afternoon, my lawyer called. "There's been a motion filed in Zurich," she said. "Someone is trying to block the Marchand Trust from including your children." I stared out the window. The sunlight caught on a crack in the glass. "They're not born yet," I said. "Exactly," she answered. "They're trying to erase them before they even arrive." I didn't flinch. Let them try. Because this time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was defending legacy. 2 weeks later, I published another letter. This time, it wasn't quiet. I partnered with a science and society blog that reached millions. My essay was part data, part declaration. When women create the future, legacy fights back. I signed it with my full name and a photo. Me, 7 months pregnant, standing in front of a blank wall, one hand on my stomach, the other holding the prototype for the hormone device I had spent years building. The response was immediate. Some celebrated. Some warned me. But one name stood out in the inbox that night. Marchand Holdings Legal Affairs. They weren't asking. They were threatening. Lucien called at midnight from Paris. "They're panicking," he said. "My uncle? He wants me disinherited. He says I've brought shame to the family." "Will they succeed?" "They don't know something," he said. "I already moved my assets. The trust for the twins was secured last month under Swiss sovereign contract law. I closed my eyes. Relief didn't feel like joy. It felt like survival." "And you?" I asked. "They cut me off." "But you stayed," I whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. By the time the sun rose, I was in the lab again, finalizing the second phase of our trial. Not just for funding, for proof, for justice. Because when the world tries to silence the voice it never believed mattered, you don't whisper back, you roar. The summons came in a thick white envelope. It wasn't from Ezra this time. It was from the Marchand family. Filed in international court, a claim for intentional reputational damage, breach of confidentiality, and inheritance obstruction. They were trying to sue me for existing. My lawyer read the document 3 times before setting it down. They're terrified of what happens if you win. We prepped day and night. Depositions, documentation, expert testimony. Lucien flew back from Paris just in time for the hearing. The moment he walked into the courtroom, whispers exploded like sparks across dry paper. He took his seat beside me, suit crisp, eyes calm. But when our glances met, I saw the flicker of something underneath. Fear, number, resolve. The hearing lasted 8 hours. The Marchand attorney, a woman with perfect diction and venom behind every sentence, tried to argue that I had deliberately manipulated a private heir for financial gain, that the children were being used as leverage, that the research I built was influenced heavily by Lucien's funding, and that the Marchands had the right to separate themselves legally from a scandal built on sentiment. When it was our turn, I stood. I didn't read from notes. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the story, without shame, without spin. "How convenient," I said, "that a family known for clinical precision suddenly sees motherhood as manipulation." I held up a journal, my lab records, every line of code I'd built. "I don't need their money," I said. "I built something more valuable, integrity." Then I turned, faced the judge directly. "My name is Alara Langley. Not theirs, not borrowed, not branded. Mine." Lucien stood beside me. "And I chose her," he said. A silence followed that felt like thunder without sound. Then the judge spoke. "I will review all submitted evidence and issue a ruling. But I'll say this. Legacy is not only in blood, it is in action. And it is clear to this court who is building one." We left without speaking. But we knew. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. That evening, I received a message I hadn't expected. It wasn't from the Marchands. It was from my father. Just one line. "Your mother had a stroke." No greeting, no apology, just those words, hollow and cold. For a moment, I sat in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Then I called the hospital. They confirmed she was stable. In recovery, no memory loss, no complications. Then the nurse added, She keeps asking for Ilara. She said she wants to say something about the baby. I didn't know what to feel. Lucian looked at me from the other room, eyes questioning. I'm not sure I can go back, I said, not even just for her. You don't have to, he replied. But maybe this time you walk in as yourself. Not their daughter, not the outcast, just you. So I went, not out of duty, out of clarity. She was smaller than I remembered. The hospital room made her look like a ghost of the woman I once feared. She opened her eyes when I entered. Ilara, she whispered. I nodded. I didn't sit. I wanted to say I'm sorry, she said, voice thin. But I don't know how. You just did, I answered. You don't get to erase the past, but you can stop repeating it. A tear rolled down her cheek. I was scared, she said. Ezra, he always said you were dangerous when you believed in something. I smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. I left the room without another word. Closure doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just exhales. 2 weeks later, the judge ruled in our favor. All claims by the Marchand family were dismissed. The twins' rights were affirmed. My research patents upheld. Legal threats dissolved. But something deeper shifted. My inbox flooded again. Not with hate, with hope. Stories from girls in small towns, women in crowded cities, young scientists shut out of rooms their brilliance should have unlocked. They didn't ask for advice. They just thanked me for making space. That month, I agreed to my first televised interview. I wore no makeup, no designer anything. Just a plain navy dress, my hair pulled back, and my full name on the screen. I told them everything, not the gossip, not the scandals, just the work, the children, the choice to keep building in the face of noise. That night, I went into labor. Lucian drove us through city lights under a purple sky, both of us half laughing, half praying not to hit red lights. They were born just past midnight. One boy, one girl. We named them Aurelio and Solène, Latin for light and sun. Because after everything the world tried to bury us beneath, we rose, and we burned brighter than they ever imagined. The first months after the twins were born passed in fragments. Feedings blurred into test results. Diaper changes into investor calls. One moment, I was holding Aurelio against my chest, counting his breaths between midnight and morning. The next, I was on Zoom, pitching the next phase of our diagnostics device, while Celine cooed softly in a wrap on my shoulder. I had never been so exhausted or so alive. The grant we received from the Zurich Foundation unlocked our first production batch. By the time the babies turned 3 months, we had 10 working units in testing across 4 clinics. I didn't talk to Ezra, didn't hear from my father, but once, quietly, without return address, a package arrived. Inside, a photograph. Old, faded, torn at the corners. It was the original version of the family portrait that used to hang over the fireplace, the one they'd updated years ago, cropping me out. This copy still had me in it, scrawled on the back in sharp black pen. We were wrong, but it took losing everything to see it. No name. I didn't put it on the wall. Didn't burn it either. I tucked it into the drawer beside the twins' birth certificates. A reminder that some ghosts learn how to apologize. That fall, I was invited to keynote the Global Women's Health Conference in Amsterdam. I brought the babies with me. I walked onto that stage in a steel gray blazer, my body still healing, my eyes shadowed from 3 hours of sleep, and delivered a speech called Invisible No More. I told them that legacy wasn't defined by whose name gets printed in a will, but by who you become after they erase you. The standing ovation wasn't what moved me. What moved me came after. A girl, maybe 17, waited near the elevators with a crumpled notebook. She handed it to me with shaking hands. "It's not a business plan," she said. "Just ideas. I didn't think I'd ever share them. Until today." I hugged her without thinking. Because once, I'd been her. And now, I was someone she could become. A week later, I received my first offer from a major firm. $10 million. Majority stake. Immediate expansion. I didn't even blink before saying no. They didn't want the tech. They wanted control. Control I'd never give again. That night, while the twins napped and I rewrote our pitch deck for the 6th time, my phone rang. Lucien. His voice sounded different, quieter, weighted. "I've been summoned," he said. "To where?" "To the estate." He didn't need to say more. The Marchand Chateau in Provence wasn't a place you visited. It was a verdict. "They're offering something," he continued, "but there's a condition." "What is it?" "They want me to sign a non-disclosure. Sever all claims to the trust. In exchange, they'll leave us alone, quietly." My chest tightened. "And if you don't?"